Well, welcome, Stephen. I'm really glad to have you here. And so we're going to talk state policy. You know, so much political discussion gets focused inside the Beltway, on Capitol Hill, federal level, but really a lot of the action is at the state level. And there was an awful lot that went on in this midterm election that was really central to that. So I want to start off by asking a little bit about, as Maria mentioned, there's a lot of new governors that are coming into office. What is the learning curve really for a new governor who comes into office on education issues, and what has the National Governors Association done to kind of bring people up to speed on the things that they're going to have to be dealing with policy-wise?
Absolutely. So essentially, for those of you who are counting, we have at least 22 governors that we're expecting. We have races that still need to be sorted out in the Virgin Islands and the Northern Mariana Islands. But the good news is this. If you look at every single governor's candidate's top priority, whether they were running as an incumbent or whether they were running as a new candidate, education was a top priority for most of them. In fact, for all the new govs coming in, at least 19 of them we could find made education a top priority. And so as we think about what they need to do to get up to speed, the first thing is, you have to learn how to be governor. You have to learn how to manage, you have to learn how to hire your staff, and you have to make sure that you're ready to go on day one. And the things working against governors on day one are this. Most of them will take office after their General Assembly sessions or their state legislative sessions have already started. And the second thing going against them is that their state budgets that are likely being considered this year have probably been written by the governor that came before them, which means that they may not have full control. So what NGA has been doing is we've been giving them as many resources as possible. We had an overwhelming majority of new governors that came to Colorado last weekend, and the good news is it appears that they are up to the task. While education was the most mentioned word in gubernatorial campaigns in 2018, that the talk of education continued. The desire to do something positive on education continued, and we're hopeful that once they get hired up and once they start and get through all of the snowstorms and the things that they have to manage as soon as they get into office on day one, that they will hit the ground running on education.
When you mentioned what's top of mind in the discussions at this new Governor's Academy training, what kind of education issues seem to bubble up? When people did talk about it, what was top of mind for them?
So really it was just a general desire to do something on education. So the thing you need to know about new governors, and actually this seminar for new governors, Lamar Alexander, who's a former governor and former chair of NGA, he called this Baby Governor School. And so at Baby Governor School, we basically make sure that they are up to speed on how to hire their staffs and be governor and just know how to do the job from a management standpoint, and also to make sure that they're ready to address any disasters that come in on day one. We give them the tools they need to succeed, and in the coming months, we'll actually help them on specific education issues that they want to hit the ground running on.
Can you touch a little bit on really kind of the unfinished business or the agenda items that these governors are going to confront in terms of school funding and finance, school safety, which is something that Maria touched on, accountability, school quality and accountability under the Every Student Succeeds Act?
Absolutely. So in equal numbers, if you look at what commitments were made by the individuals who were elected to be governor, equal numbers, Republican and Democrat, actually agreed that something needed to be done on school finance. Where they disagreed was how to do it. And I think that's the biggest difference and the biggest dichotomy you're going to see as state legislative sessions get underway and governors take the oath of office is, while I think addressing funding in states is going to be the top issue that we again see this state legislative session and as a priority of governors' offices, you're going to see dramatically different proposals. And I think for those governors who will find it difficult to raise revenues in the state, I think those are going to be the ones that are going to face the most difficult decisions. State governments, because of the recession, are cut to the bone already. For most states, there is no place left to cut, which means that governors are going to have to get creative in how they come up with ways to compensate their teachers, and they're also going to have to get creative with what they're going to do to make sure that teachers are taken care of if they can't give them dramatic pay raises. One of the proposals that came out during the election was from current Congressman, future Governor of Colorado, Jared Polis. He believes that it's the state's role to start to provide affordable housing for teachers. And one of the campaign promises and proposals that he put out there is essentially the state partnering with local governments in high-need areas where it's hard to attract teachers to essentially provide housing for teachers. So if they can't give them a top salary, they can at least alleviate their rent.
Did school safety issues come up at all? I mean, this is certainly, as a result of the tragedies earlier this year, dominated a lot of state legislatures. There were dramatic proposals that took place in many different states.
School safety was a named top priority of 25 governors who ultimately won their elections, or 25 governors-elect. It became a campaign point because it was a point in real life. And so as we think about what to do about school safety, obviously when we've talked about disasters before and responding to disasters as new governors were coming in, we were talking about weather events. We were talking about different things like earthquakes and tornadoes that can happen. And now, because of this new era that we're in around protecting our schools, that is now an issue that governors have to consider on day one. So when we think about disasters, when we think about tragedies in states, a new picture is emerging when it comes to school safety. Now, as far as what governors can do about that when they come into office, I think there's a lot they can do on their own, but obviously as it being a controversial issue and being that it has died down a little bit, it'll be interesting to see if it's as top of mind this legislative session as it was the last. But I do think that there is a conversation here and another topic that we're going to be discussing nationally at the beginning of next year, which is infrastructure. As governors come in and think about public-private partnerships, as they think about what they're going to do on day one as governor to build bridges, build roads, build buildings, there's a lot to be said about investments that should be made in school infrastructure. But at the same time, as governors are representing themselves at the federal level, we need to talk about what flexibility will be there for states to spend any new federal infrastructure funds on school facilities.
To make the pivot to the feds just a little bit,
Sure.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the relationship that governors face and that states face with regard to the U.S. Department of Education. And there's going to be a learning curve here. These folks are going to have to get acquainted. Things are reset somewhat under the Every Student Succeeds Act. How is that going? What are the challenges for states essentially seizing some of this ESSA flexibility if it exists?
So I think there's two stories with the state-federal relationship on education right now. I think there's one on K-12 education, where you had secretaries of education before 2015 that had a fair amount of say over how K-12 education should be delivered in schools. And then Congress took away a fair amount of that say that the U.S. Department of Education, the Secretary of Education, has had. And so when it comes to K-12 education, other than the approval of state plans, there has not been any interventions from the U.S. Department of Education or really any hand from the U.S. Department of Education since we've had the new administration. And that is not necessarily the worst thing when it comes to states, because states have been jump-starting their K-12 systems using the opportunity that is the Every Student Succeeds Act. So here's where there's a different story, and that is how this is going to play out as it comes to new leadership. We know at the local level that new leadership means change, and it's not always a good change at the local level when you have new superintendents, you have new principals coming in. At the state level, it's National Governors Association's job to make sure that governors are in the best position to make sure that this change in leadership is a positive thing, and it has as minimal disruption as possible. But that said, there are several tools that governors have at their disposal when it comes to the Every Student Succeeds Act. One is they now sign off on the state plan. And there is going to be a series of amendments that could be filed within governor's first few weeks in office at the U.S. Department of Education to either make minor changes to their plan and maybe even in some cases make wholesale major changes to their plan depending on the turnover in leadership. There's also another factor here that comes to the change in state education, K-12 education leadership. We have heard that there could be and have projected that there could be up to 20, probably over 20 new state education officials, state education agency, chief state school officers that will be in place in states. As new governors are coming in, at least 22, with up to 23 or 24 new state chiefs that could be coming in across the country, bridging that relationship and having a strong relationship with your chief state school officer is going to be the most critical thing when it comes to implementing ESSA. And also, the Department of Education needs to give governors and state chiefs as much time as possible to figure out what the new game plan is on ESSA, if it is new at all.
I wanted to ask about a couple of really concrete things.
Sure.
At the state level. As Maria mentioned, Congress, although this particular Congress may not have done a lot on education, they did pass a bill, Career Technical Education Bill. Now, career and technical education and workforce training is a very top-of-mind subject for governors. What action do you see on their part going forward?
Great. So 27 of the individuals who won their gubernatorial elections, whether incumbent or new candidates, made career and technical education a priority. It was listed on their website. It was something that they talked about regularly during the campaign. The career and technical education law that Congress just passed is a huge opportunity for new governors. because I'm going to go back to the tool they have under ESSA. They sign off on the state plans. This is a new movement in federal education policy, giving governors the ability to have some say over what the state-federal relationship should look like in K-12. And so as we think about those plans coming together, and as we know that there is going to be less of a role for the U.S. Department of Education when it comes to the state plans versus what there was under the Every Student Succeeds Act, I think that this is an opportunity for states to come together, to not have to worry about the bureaucracy of getting a state plan approved and worry more about submitting something to the federal government and giving some sort of strategic plan to the local school districts to make career and technical education work. Granted, I think for those 27 governors who were coming in who have made career and technical education a priority, we've told them one thing that's disappointing, and that is the Perkins Career and Technical Education funding that's coming in with this new law is about $1.2 billion. It's going to be a little bit more in next year. That's not enough to make major changes across the country in career and technical education. There is going to have to be a conversation between the governor and the state legislature about whether they want to prioritize this, and also whether they're going to work with some private businesses and try to bring in some private money and public-private partnerships and partnering with private businesses on coming up with new career and technical education models, not just in K-12, but also at the higher education space, using apprenticeships, using pre-apprenticeships. These are all tools that are at governors' disposals where, in some cases, they are less expensive than coming up with new classroom-focused career and technical education.
Now, we don't have a lot of time left, sure, but I said before that we were going to do a little crystal ball gazing here.
Sure.
Looking forward to 2020, there's really kind of a window of opportunity for these governors to make some impact between now and then. What do you see happening in terms of traction between now and looking forward to the next reckoning, 2020?
So I'll start with what I hope for. I hope that governors ignore everything political that's going on in D.C. And I also hope that bipartisanship prevails. One of the most encouraging things we saw last weekend with all the new governors is, we don't have them for very long, but they were together for a period of 48 hours, new Republican governors, new Democratic governors. And by the time it was over, they were talking as though they were friends, and they've known each other for a long time. At the National Governors Association, it is our job to bring governors together at the national level, but it's also our job to bring governors together at the state level around state solutions. And so my hope is that governors, new governors, incumbent governors that won the re-election, they start to look at their neighbors and they see that even though they have a Democrat and Republican after their name and they may be of different parties, that they were running on the same things. They want the same things for their education system. They have the same goals. They want to make sure that there is enough funding for K-12 education. They want to make sure that college is more affordable. They all said the same things. They may have all had different ways of getting there, but as we saw with the class of governors that came in 2010, at least 32 new governors came in 2010. By the end of that 8-year period, governors were copying each other. Governors that ran on one thing and said that they were going to do basically address education in some way, and it was a very partisan way. They ended up looking to their Republican neighbor or their Democratic neighbor and doing it the way that they had done it in their state. The most notable example of that is free college, the College Promise campaign in Tennessee. We have a Republican governor who made community college as affordable as possible, in some cases free, and you have Democratic governors across the country, Republican governors across the country who look at what Bill Haslam has done in Tennessee and said, I want to do that. We need more examples of that across the country, and in order to do that, we need them to ignore the politics of this town.
Really interesting. We have, thank you. I think we have time for maybe a minute's worth of questions, if we have any questions from the audience. We have the microphone right here in the center that folks can come to.
Hi, my name is Ben Williams. I'm a teacher here in D.C. I'm just curious, you had said that a lot of incoming governors are on board with making school funding a priority, but then you had mentioned that they're disagreeing on how to do that. Can you just kind of paint a general picture on how they're thinking about addressing school funding and what different options exist?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for what you do. Your job is a lot harder than mine. And second, it really just it involves revenues or no revenues. That is the broad category, which is if you are a traditionally conservative governor and your state has not raised income taxes or has not raised sales taxes or has not raised any sort of revenues or fees in your state that produce revenues, that is going to be a challenge. If you are in a traditionally liberal state where there has not been a fear to raise taxes, it is easier to fill that gap. We saw in the state of Washington when their state Supreme Court started fining them quite a bit of money every day because they were not fully funding their education system under a constitution. It took a little while, but they were able to bridge that gap. In Washington, that's easy. In Kentucky, that's harder. Where we have to make sure that when we're helping governors kind of come up with solutions, it's going to be very hard to help them come up with things to do that don't cost any money. And so I think that's the challenge. In Arizona, you saw an example where you had a teacher funding shortage, you had a teacher salary crisis, you had teachers marching on the state capitol, and they actually started to raise revenues. I think you're going to have a lot more cases where if teachers are exerting pressure, if the education establishment is exerting pressure, and there is a public outcry for something to happen, that's when state legislators who have been traditionally fiscally conservative may have to look to this as an emergency and come up with some additional funding. So really it comes down to funding. And the funding options that governors laid out during the campaign and governors-elect laid out during the campaign that didn't cost any money are only a partial solution.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our audience as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.